Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood in the sterile hallway of Chicago General Hospital, her hands trembling as she read the letter that would change everything. The hospital administration had made their decision clear. At 62, she was being forced into early retirement. The words budget constraints and modernization efforts felt like euphemisms for what everyone was really thinking but wouldn't say out loud: she was too old. The irony wasn't lost on her. After 35 years of saving lives, pioneering surgical techniques, and training countless young doctors, her experience was suddenly viewed as a liability rather than an asset. The younger staff members avoided eye contact as they passed her in the corridors, their silence speaking volumes about the uncomfortable truth that hung in the air like disinfectant. Sarah had always believed that medicine was about healing, not politics. She had dedicated her entire adult life to the profession, missing family gatherings, sacrificing personal relationships, and working through countless holidays. Her apartment reflected this dedication: sparse furniture, medical journals stacked high on every surface, and photographs of successful surgeries rather than family vacations adorning the walls. The letter specified her last day would be in 2 weeks. 2 weeks to wrap up a career that had defined her entire identity. As she walked through the hospital corridors one more time that evening, memories flooded back like scenes from a movie she had starred in but never really watched. She remembered her first day as a medical student, how the senior physicians had questioned whether a woman could handle the physical and emotional demands of surgery. She proved them wrong by graduating at the top of her class and completing one of the most competitive surgical residencies in the country. Those early years had been brutal 18-hour days, impossible cases, and the constant pressure to prove that she belonged in a male-dominated field. But Sarah had persevered. She developed a reputation for taking on the cases that other surgeons deemed too risky or complex. Her steady hands and innovative approaches saved lives that others had written off as lost causes. She published research papers that changed surgical protocols worldwide and spoke at conferences across 6 continents. Now, as she cleaned out her office, each award and certificate felt like evidence from a trial where she had already been found guilty of the crime of aging. The framed photo of her receiving the Distinguished Service Award from the American College of Surgeons seemed to mock her from its place on the desk. Distinguished Service, apparently, had an expiration date. The news of her forced retirement spread quickly through the medical community. Former colleagues called to express their sympathy, but their words felt hollow. Everyone understood the reality of modern healthcare economics, but no one wanted to acknowledge how it felt to be discarded like outdated equipment. Sarah's sister, Margaret, flew in from Seattle to help with the transition. Margaret had always been the practical one, the accountant who had built a stable life with a husband, 2 children, and a predictable routine. She couldn't understand why Sarah was taking the retirement so hard. "You've worked hard enough," Margaret said as she helped pack medical textbooks into boxes. "Maybe it's time to enjoy life, travel a little, take up gardening or something relaxing." But Sarah couldn't explain that surgery wasn't just her job, it was who she was. The operating room was where she felt most alive, most useful, most herself. Without it, she felt like an actor without a stage, a musician without an instrument. The local news picked up the story of her forced retirement, spinning it as a feel-good piece about a dedicated doctor finally getting the rest she deserved. The reporter, a young woman barely out of college, asked Sarah about her plans for retirement with the kind of enthusiasm reserved for discussing vacation destinations. "I'm not ready to retire," Sarah said during the interview, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "I have more to give, more lives to save." The reporter's smile faltered slightly. This wasn't the narrative she had expected. "But surely after such a distinguished career, you must be looking forward to some well-deserved rest?" Sarah looked directly into the camera. "Would you ask a painter to stop painting because they turned 60? Would you tell a teacher to stop teaching because they had gray hair? I've spent decades perfecting my craft, and I've never been better at what I do." The interview aired that evening, but it was edited down to a brief segment that focused more on her retirement party than her protests about ageism in medicine. The station's demographic research had probably determined that viewers didn't want to hear uncomfortable truths about how society treats its aging professionals. As Sarah's last day approached, she found herself questioning everything she had believed about fairness, merit, and the value of experience. She had always thought that competence and dedication would be enough, that good work would speak for itself. The harsh reality of her situation suggested otherwise. Her final surgery was a complex cardiac procedure on a young father who had suffered a heart attack while coaching his daughter's soccer team. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She was saving a life on the same day the hospital was ending her career. Her hands moved with the precision and confidence that came from thousands of similar procedures, each incision deliberate and sure. The surgery was successful, but as Sarah removed her gloves and mask for the last time in this operating room, she felt a profound sense of loss. The patient would recover, go home to his family, and probably never know that his surgeon had just been forced to end her career. The retirement party was a surreal affair. Colleagues who had supported the administration's decision now stood around making speeches about Sarah's contributions and expressing wishes for her happiness in retirement. The cake was decorated with a stethoscope and the words "Happy Retirement," as if this were a celebration rather than a professional funeral. Dr. Harrison, the chief of staff who had delivered the news of her forced retirement, gave a lengthy speech about Sarah's distinguished career and the hospital's gratitude for her service. His words were carefully crafted to sound appreciative while avoiding any acknowledgement of the circumstances surrounding her departure. As the evening wound down and colleagues began to leave, Sarah found herself alone in the break room where she had spent countless hours over the years. The vending machine hummed in the corner, the same machine that had been there when she first started. Everything looked the same, but everything had changed. She thought about the young medical students she had mentored over the years, wondering if any of them would face the same fate when they reached her age. Would medicine continue to discard its most experienced practitioners in favor of younger, cheaper alternatives? The questions felt heavy in the quiet room. That night, Sarah sat in her apartment surrounded by boxes of memories from her career. The silence was deafening after decades of hospital noise, beeping machines, urgent announcements, the constant hum of activity that came with saving lives around the clock. For the first time in 35 years, she had nowhere to be in the morning, no surgeries scheduled, no lives depending on her expertise. She opened her laptop and began browsing job listings, but the reality was stark. Every position specified preferred age ranges that excluded her, used code words like digital native and energetic team player that translated to young. The medical field she had devoted her life to seemed to have no place for someone like her. As she closed the laptop and prepared for bed, Sarah wondered if this was how it would end, with a whimper rather than a bang, with forced obsolescence rather than chosen departure. She had always imagined she would know when it was time to retire, that the decision would be hers to make based on her own assessment of her abilities and desire to continue. The next morning brought no surgery schedule, no early rounds, no urgent pages. Instead, there was just the empty day ahead and the crushing realization that a lifetime of purpose had been arbitrarily terminated by people who valued cost-cutting over experience. Sarah made coffee and sat at her kitchen table, still in her robe at 9 in the morning, something that would have been unthinkable during her working years. The newspaper lay unopened beside her cup, its headlines about distant conflicts and political controversies seeming irrelevant to her immediate crisis of identity and purpose. She thought about calling former colleagues, but most of them were busy with their own careers, their own surgeries, their own responsibilities. The medical community moved on quickly from departing members, closing ranks and adjusting to new realities with the efficiency of a trauma team responding to an emergency. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah struggled to find meaning in retirement. She tried reading novels, something she hadn't had time for in decades, but found herself unable to concentrate. She attempted to reconnect with old friends who had retired years earlier, but their conversations about grandchildren and cruise ships felt foreign to someone whose entire identity had been wrapped up in her profession. The forced inactivity was harder than any surgery she had ever performed. Her hands, trained to save lives with precise movements, now had nothing meaningful to do. The knowledge accumulated over decades of practice sat unused in her mind like expensive equipment gathering dust in storage. It was during one of these particularly difficult days, as Sarah sat in her apartment questioning the value of her entire career, that everything would change. A phone call was coming that would transform her from a discarded doctor into someone whose skills were desperately needed in one of the most dangerous places on earth. The same hands that had been deemed too old for the sterile halls of Chicago General Hospital would soon be called upon to perform miracles in the war-torn streets of Iraq. The phone rang at 7 in the morning, cutting through the silence of Sarah's apartment like a scalpel through skin. She had been awake for hours, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with another sleepless night. 3 months into retirement, she still couldn't adjust to the absence of purpose that had once driven her from bed before dawn every day. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, crisp and official. "Dr. Mitchell? This is Colonel Patricia Rodriguez with the U.S. Army Medical Command. I hope I'm not calling too early." Sarah sat up straighter, her medical training automatically kicking in. Emergency calls at unusual hours meant someone needed help. "Not at all, Colonel. How can I assist you?" "Dr. Mitchell, we've reviewed your file and your surgical experience. We have an unusual situation that requires someone with your specific skill set. Are you familiar with Doctors Without Borders or similar humanitarian medical organizations?" Sarah's heart began to race for the first time in months. "I've heard of them, of course. Are you suggesting some kind of volunteer opportunity?" "Something like that, but more complex. We're dealing with a critical shortage of experienced trauma surgeons in Iraq, specifically in the Fallujah region. The situation there is challenging. We need someone who can handle the most difficult cases under extreme conditions." The words hung in the air. Iraq. Fallujah. Everyone knew about the ongoing conflict, the daily reports of casualties and chaos. It was exactly the kind of dangerous, high-stakes environment that most people her age would avoid at all costs. "Colonel, I should mention that I'm 62 years old. I was recently forced into retirement from my hospital position." There was a brief pause, then, something that might have been a chuckle. "Dr. Mitchell, with respect, we're not looking for young, inexperienced doctors. We need someone who's seen everything, who won't panic under pressure, who can make life or death decisions with steady hands and a clear mind." "Your age isn't a liability, it's exactly what we need." For the first time in months, Sarah felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came with being needed, being essential. "Tell me more about what this would involve." The colonel's voice became more serious. "I won't lie to you, Doctor. Fallujah is one of the most dangerous places on Earth right now. The medical facilities are primitive compared to what you're used to. You'd be treating combat injuries, civilian casualties, working with limited supplies and constant security threats. It's not for everyone." Sarah found herself standing, pacing her apartment as she spoke. "What kind of cases would I be handling? Gunshot wounds, IED injuries, burns, complex trauma cases that would challenge even the best surgeons in the best hospitals. The difference is you'd be doing it in a converted building with irregular power, limited equipment, and the sound of gunfire outside." The description should have been terrifying, but Sarah felt energized for the first time since her forced retirement. This was real medicine, stripped of bureaucracy and insurance considerations and hospital politics. This was about saving lives, pure and simple. How long would the deployment be? Initially 6 months, with the possibility of extension if you choose. "Dr. Mitchell, I have to ask, are you sure you're interested? Most people in your situation would prefer a quieter retirement." Sarah looked around her apartment, at the medical journals gathering dust, at the empty schedule that stretched endlessly ahead. "Colonel, when would you need an answer? Take some time to think about it. This isn't a decision to make lightly. I'll send you detailed information about the position, security protocols, living conditions, everything you'd need to know. You have a week to decide." After hanging up, Sarah sat in stunned silence. In the space of one phone call, her life had been turned upside down again, but this time in a completely different direction. Instead of being told she was too old and expendable, someone was asking her to take on one of the most challenging medical assignments in the world. She called her sister Margaret, who listened to the proposal with growing horror. "Sarah, you can't be serious. You're talking about going to a war zone. You could be killed." "I could be killed crossing the street here in Chicago," Sarah replied, though she knew that wasn't really the point. "But you're retired. You're supposed to be relaxing, maybe taking up hobbies, traveling to safe places with good hotels and room service." Sarah tried to explain the feeling of purposelessness that had consumed her since leaving the hospital, but Margaret couldn't understand. To her, retirement was a reward for years of hard work. To Sarah, it felt like a slow death. Besides, Margaret continued, what do you know about treating war injuries? You're a cardiac surgeon, not a combat medic. That comment stung because it contained a grain of truth. Sarah's specialty was indeed cardiac surgery, performed in controlled environments with teams of specialists and state-of-the-art equipment. But her training had been broad, and her early years had included trauma surgery. More importantly, she had the kind of general surgical skills that came from decades of experience. The information packet arrived 3 days later, and Sarah spent hours reading through every detail. The security briefings were sobering: daily threats from insurgents, irregular supply lines, primitive living conditions. The medical challenges were equally daunting: massive trauma cases, limited blood supplies, no specialists to consult with when cases became complicated. But, buried in the technical details was something that made Sarah's decision clear: casualty statistics. Young soldiers and innocent civilians were dying from injuries that could be survivable with proper surgical intervention. The current medical staff, while dedicated, lacked the experience to handle the most complex cases. Sarah found herself thinking about the young father whose heart surgery had been her final operation at Chicago General. Someone's son or daughter was bleeding out in Fallujah right now, and the local medical team might not have the skills to save them. She spent the week researching everything she could about combat surgery, reading medical journals about war zone medicine, studying the types of injuries commonly seen in conflict areas. It was like preparing for the boards all over again, except this time the stakes were life and death in the most literal sense. The night before her decision deadline, Sarah called her former mentor, Dr. Elizabeth Chen, who had retired 5 years earlier from her position as chief of surgery at Johns Hopkins. Elizabeth, if someone offered you the chance to go back to surgery, under any conditions, would you take it? Dr. Chen was quiet for a long moment. Sarah, are you talking about that opportunity in Iraq that's been circulating through the medical community? You heard about it? The Army has been quietly reaching out to retired surgeons with extensive trauma experience. They contacted me too, but I turned them down. I'm 71, Sarah. My hands aren't steady enough anymore, and I have grandchildren to consider. Sarah felt a mixture of disappointment and relief. Disappointment that her mentor wouldn't be there to provide guidance, but relief that her own situation was different. Her hands were still steady, her mind sharp, her reflexes quick. What do you think I should do? I think, Dr. Chen said carefully, that you're one of the finest surgeons I've ever known. I also think that medicine lost something valuable when they forced you out of Chicago General. If you feel called to do this, if you believe you can make a difference, then maybe it's exactly what you're supposed to be doing. The next morning, Sarah called Colonel Rodriguez. Colonel, I've made my decision. When do I leave? The preparation process was intense and surreal. Sarah found herself at military training facilities learning about chemical weapon protocols, emergency evacuation procedures, and basic security awareness. At 62, she was running obstacle courses with soldiers young enough to be her grandchildren, learning to identify different types of weapons by their sound, and practicing surgical techniques with battlefield equipment. The other medical personnel in training were mostly young doctors and nurses seeking adventure or wanting to make a difference in their early careers. Sarah's presence drew curious looks and occasional whispered conversations, but the training staff treated her with the same professional respect they showed everyone else. During one particularly grueling simulation exercise, where medical teams had to perform surgery while loudspeakers blared gunfire sounds and smoke filled the training facility, Sarah found herself in her element. While younger doctors struggled with the chaos and noise, her decades of experience in high-pressure situations served her well. Doctor, how are you staying so calm? Asked Dr. James Peterson, a 28-year-old emergency medicine physician who would be part of her team. Experience, Sarah replied simply, not looking up from her simulated patient. When you've performed surgery during natural disasters, when you've worked through hospital emergencies, when you've saved lives while the building was being evacuated due to bomb threats, you learn to focus on what matters. As her departure date approached, Sarah felt a mixture of nervousness and excitement that she hadn't experienced since her early days as a surgeon. She was scared, certainly, but it was the good kind of fear, the fear that came with stepping outside her comfort zone to do something meaningful. The media got wind of the story somehow, and Sarah found herself fielding calls from reporters wanting to write about the grandmother heading to war. She declined most interviews, but agreed to speak with one journalist who seemed genuinely interested in the larger issues of ageism in medicine and the value of experienced practitioners. Dr. Mitchell, what would you say to people who think you're too old for this kind of assignment? Sarah considered the question carefully. I'd say that experience has value that can't be replicated. You can't teach steady hands under pressure, you can't download decades of clinical judgment, and you can't simulate the confidence that comes from having seen every possible complication and knowing how to handle it. The night before her departure, Sarah sat in her apartment one last time, looking at the boxes she had packed when leaving the hospital. Everything she thought she would never need again was now being shipped to Iraq: her surgical instruments, her reference books, her lucky scrubs that she had worn for particularly challenging operations. She had already signed papers making her sister the beneficiary of her possessions, just in case. It was a sobering reminder of what she was walking into, but it also felt like closing one chapter of her life and opening another. As Sarah lay in bed that final night, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a discarded doctor, forced into unwanted retirement and questioning the value of her entire career. Tomorrow, she would board a military transport to Iraq, where her skills would be desperately needed and deeply valued. The irony was profound. The same hands that Chicago General had deemed too old for their sterile corridors would soon be the most experienced pair in one of the most dangerous medical environments on Earth. The same mind that hospital administrators had considered past its prime would soon be making split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death for people whose only hope was the skill of an over-the-hill surgeon. As sleep finally came, Sarah's last thought was a prayer for steady hands and clear judgment. Tomorrow, she would discover whether a lifetime of medical training could prepare her for the chaos and horror of Fallujah. The heat hit Sarah like a physical blow as she stepped off the military transport at Baghdad International Airport. Even through her body armor and helmet, she could feel the intensity of the Iraqi sun bearing down on everything. The landscape was a harsh mixture of concrete, dust, and distant smoke plumes that spoke of ongoing conflict. The helicopter ride to Fallujah was her first real taste of what she had signed up for. As the aircraft flew low over the scarred cityscape, Sarah could see the evidence of war everywhere: bombed buildings, abandoned vehicles, streets empty of normal civilian life. The rhythmic thump of the helicopter blades was occasionally punctuated by distant explosions that made her stomach clench. Dr. Peterson, the young emergency physician she had trained with, sat across from her looking pale despite his tan from the Baghdad sun. Starting to wonder what we got ourselves into, he shouted over the noise. Sarah squeezed his shoulder reassuringly. Just remember your training. Focus on the medicine, everything else is just background noise. But, even as she said it, Sarah felt her own doubts creeping in. The reality of a war zone was different from any training simulation. The smells were different: burning fuel, concrete dust, and something else she couldn't quite identify but instinctively knew was danger. The sounds were constant and unsettling: not just explosions, but a high-pitched whine of military vehicles, shouted commands in multiple languages, and an underlying tension that seemed to permeate everything. The medical facility in Fallujah was housed in what had once been a school building. The classrooms had been converted into treatment areas, operating rooms, and recovery spaces. Sandbags were piled around the windows, and the walls bore the scars of previous attacks: bullet holes that had been patched but not painted over. Dr. Maria Santos, the outgoing chief medical officer, met Sarah at the entrance. She looked exhausted in a way that went beyond simple fatigue, the bone-deep tiredness of someone who had been carrying too much responsibility for too long. Dr. Mitchell, thank God you're here. I was starting to think I'd have to extend my tour again. Dr. Santos was 42, a trauma surgeon from Houston who had been in Fallujah for 8 months. I have to warn you, nothing really prepares you for what you're about to see. The tour of the facility was sobering. The main operating room had been set up in what was once the school gymnasium, with 2 surgical tables under industrial lighting that ran off generators. The equipment was functional but basic: no fancy monitors, no robotic surgical systems, just the essential tools needed to save lives. We get power from the generators about 18 hours a day, Dr. Santos explained as they walked through the facility. When we lose power during surgery, we use flashlights and keep working. You learn to operate by feel more than sight. The recovery area was a series of cots lined up in former classrooms. Patients ranged from coalition soldiers to Iraqi civilians to suspected insurgents, all receiving the same level of care regardless of which side of the conflict they represented. "That's one thing you learn quickly here," Dr. Santos said, noticing Sarah's gaze. "When someone's bleeding out on your table, their politics don't matter. A 17-year-old kid with a gunshot wound is just a 17-year-old kid who needs help." Sarah's first case came just 4 hours after her arrival. She was still unpacking her personal gear when the alarm sounded: incoming casualties from an IED explosion. The controlled chaos that followed was unlike anything from her hospital experience. Multiple patients arrived simultaneously, carried in on stretchers by soldiers whose own uniforms were stained with their friends' blood. The triage process was brutal and immediate, determining who could be saved, who could wait, and who was beyond help. It was medical decision-making stripped to its most essential elements. Sarah found herself assigned to a young Marine who couldn't have been more than 20. His left leg was mangled from the explosion, and he was losing blood despite the field medic's efforts to control the bleeding. His eyes were wide with shock and pain, but he was conscious and aware. "Am I going to die?" he whispered as Sarah examined his wounds. "Not if I can help it," she replied, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. It was a phrase she had used thousands of times in civilian hospitals, but here it carried a different weight. The surgery required all of Sarah's skills and experience. Working with limited equipment and poor lighting, she had to repair damaged arteries, remove shrapnel, and salvage what she could of the damaged muscle and bone. The young Marine's life depended on decisions she had to make in seconds, with no time for consultation or second opinions. 3 hours later, the Marine was stable and would keep his leg. As Sarah stripped off her surgical gloves, she realized her hands were perfectly steady. The skills that had been deemed obsolete by Chicago General Hospital had just saved a young man's life in the most challenging surgical environment imaginable. "Nice work," Dr. Santos said as they cleaned up. "How was that compared to your usual cardiac procedures?" Sarah considered the question. "Different tools, same principles. Anatomy is anatomy, bleeding is bleeding. The environment is more challenging, but the fundamentals of surgery don't change." But, even as she said it, Sarah knew that wasn't entirely true. There was something different about surgery in a war zone that went beyond the technical aspects. Every decision carried more weight because there were no second chances, no ability to transfer patients to specialists, no room for error. Over the following weeks, Sarah settled into the rhythm of combat medicine. The cases were relentless and varied: gunshot wounds, blast injuries, burns, and trauma cases that would have been distributed among multiple specialists in civilian hospitals. Here, she had to be all of those specialists rolled into one. The living conditions were Spartan. Sarah's quarters consisted of a small room that had once been a supply closet, with a cot, a small desk, and just enough space for her personal belongings. Privacy was minimal, quiet was non-existent, and comfort was a luxury from her past life. But, despite the harsh conditions, Sarah found herself energized in a way she hadn't felt in years. Every day brought new challenges, new opportunities to use her skills in ways that directly impacted whether people lived or died. The bureaucracy and politics that had dominated her final years at Chicago General were completely absent here. The other medical staff began to notice the difference Sarah's experience made. Dr. Peterson, who had struggled with some of the more complex trauma cases, started specifically requesting to work with her. "Dr. Mitchell, can you look at this chest trauma?" "I'm not sure about the best approach," he would ask, and Sarah would guide him through procedures that drew on decades of surgical experience. Word of her surgical skills began to spread beyond the medical facility. Military personnel started referring to complex cases as Dr. Mitchell cases, meaning they required the kind of advanced surgical expertise that only comes with extensive experience. One morning, about 6 weeks into her deployment, Sarah was awakened by unusual commotion outside her quarters. Through her small window, she could see military vehicles arriving and high-ranking officers emerging. She dressed quickly, assuming there had been a major incident requiring all medical staff. Instead, she found herself face to face with Brigadier General David Thompson, a career military officer whose reputation preceded him. General Thompson had heard about the veteran surgeon who was performing miracles in Fallujah and had come to see for himself. "Dr. Mitchell, I've been hearing remarkable things about the work you're doing here," the general said as they toured the medical facility. "Your colleagues tell me you've been handling cases that would challenge teams of specialists in major trauma centers." Sarah felt uncomfortable with the praise. "I'm just doing my job, General. The same job I did for 35 years before coming here." "That's exactly my point," General Thompson replied. "The Army tried to recruit you because of your experience, but I understand you were forced into retirement from your previous position?" The conversation that followed was unlike any Sarah had experienced in her medical career. General Thompson, it turned out, was conducting his own informal study of how civilian medical institutions were treating their experienced practitioners. He had been appalled to learn that hospitals were forcing out skilled surgeons just as the military was desperately seeking those same skills. "Dr. Mitchell, what you're doing here is proving a point about the value of experience that I think the civilian medical world needs to hear," he said as they watched her team prepare for an incoming casualty. As if summoned by their conversation, the emergency alarm sounded. Multiple casualties were coming in from a complex attack that had resulted in both military and civilian injuries. Sarah immediately shifted into surgical mode, the general and their conversation forgotten as she focused on the immediate task of saving lives. The cases that followed were some of the most challenging Sarah had faced since arriving in Fallujah. A young Iraqi girl, perhaps 8 years old, had been caught in crossfire and suffered massive abdominal trauma. The complexity of her injuries would have required a team of pediatric specialists in any major hospital. Working alone with only basic equipment, Sarah spent 4 hours reconstructing the child's damaged organs. The surgery required every technique she had learned over her career, combined with improvisations that only decades of experience could provide. At several points, less experienced surgeons might have given up, but Sarah's determination and skill kept her working through seemingly impossible complications. When the little girl finally stabilized, General Thompson was still there, having observed the entire procedure from outside the operating room. His expression had changed from professional interest to something approaching awe. "Doctor, I've watched military surgeons with 20 years of experience, and I've never seen anything like what you just accomplished," he said quietly. "That child is alive because of skills that some hospital administrator decided were obsolete." As news of the successful surgery spread through the facility, Sarah began to understand that her work in Fallujah was about more than just treating individual patients. Every successful case was a statement about the value of experience, the importance of retaining skilled practitioners, and the short-sightedness of age discrimination in medicine. The young Iraqi girl's recovery became a symbol of hope not just for her family, but for everyone in the facility. Her laughter as she played with toys donated by soldiers echoed through the converted school building, reminding everyone why they were there and what they were fighting for. But Sarah knew that her time in Fallujah was also changing her in ways she hadn't expected. The intensity of working in a war zone, the constant awareness of mortality, and the direct connection between her skills and survival had stripped away many of the comfortable illusions of civilian medicine. Here, there was no hiding behind insurance requirements or hospital policies. Every decision was about life and death, every procedure was performed because it was medically necessary, not because it was profitable. It was medicine in its purest form, and Sarah found herself wondering if she could ever go back to the sanitized, bureaucratic world of civilian hospitals. As her original 6-month deployment neared its end, Sarah faced a decision that would determine the next phase of her life. The Army had offered her an extension, and General Thompson had made it clear that her work was having an impact far beyond the individual lives she was saving. But staying meant more months of danger, more separation from family, more time in conditions that were physically and emotionally demanding. At 62, she had already proven her point about the value of experience. The question was whether she was ready to return to civilian life or commit to continuing this unexpected chapter of her career. The explosion that changed everything happened on a Tuesday morning in Sarah's 5th month in Fallujah. She was reviewing patient charts when the building shook with unusual violence, followed by the distinctive sound of small arms fire much closer than usual. Within minutes, the emergency alarm was blaring, but this time it wasn't just about incoming casualties, the medical facility itself was under direct attack. Sarah found herself helping to move patients to the most protected area of the building while bullets shattered windows and ricocheted off walls. The young Iraqi girl she had operated on months earlier clung to her leg, terrified by the noise and chaos. In that moment, Sarah realized how much her perspective had changed. 6 months ago, this kind of situation would have been unthinkable. Now, she was calmly organizing an evacuation while under fire. "Dr. Mitchell, we need you in the main or," shouted Dr. Peterson over the din. "We've got multiple trauma cases coming in, including some of our own security personnel." The next several hours tested every skill Sarah had developed over her entire career. Working while the building periodically shook from nearby explosions, she performed surgery on wounded soldiers while medics used their own bodies to shield patients from debris falling from the damaged ceiling. One case in particular would stay with her forever. Sergeant Maria Rodriguez, a young woman who reminded Sarah of herself 40 years earlier, had taken shrapnel to the abdomen while defending the medical facility. Her injuries were severe, and she was losing blood faster than they could replace it. "Doc, am I going to make it?" Sergeant Rodriguez whispered, her voice weak but her eyes still fierce. Sarah looked into those eyes and saw the same determination that had carried her through medical school, residency, and decades of challenging surgeries. "You're going to make it because neither one of us knows how to give up." The surgery required Sarah to work in conditions that would have been impossible in civilian medicine. With limited blood supplies and sporadic power, she had to repair internal organs while the building continued to shake from explosions. At one point, the lights went out completely, and she finished a critical suture by flashlight held by Dr. Peterson. But Sergeant Rodriguez survived, and her recovery became a turning point for Sarah's understanding of her role in Fallujah. She wasn't just treating patients, she was preserving hope, demonstrating that experience and skill could triumph over impossible circumstances. The attack on the medical facility made international news, and Sarah found herself thrust into the spotlight in a way she had never anticipated. General Thompson arranged for an interview with a military journalist, and Sarah's story began to spread beyond the confines of Fallujah. "Dr. Mitchell, you could have spent your retirement in comfort and safety. What drives you to work under these conditions?" the journalist asked. Sarah considered the question while watching Sergeant Rodriguez take her first steps after surgery. "In civilian medicine, we sometimes lose sight of why we became doctors. Here, every day, I remember. These young men and women, these civilians caught in conflict, they need someone who's seen everything, who won't panic when things get difficult. Experience isn't just useful here, it's life-saving." The story of the surgeon of Fallujah began to circulate in medical journals, news outlets, and social media. Sarah found herself receiving messages from fellow physicians who had faced similar age discrimination, from medical students inspired by her courage, and from military families grateful for her service. But it was a letter from the administration at Chicago General Hospital that truly captured the irony of her situation. The hospital board, facing negative publicity about their treatment of experienced physicians, invited her to return to her old position with improved terms and a public apology. Sarah read the letter while sitting in her small quarters, listening to the distant sound of helicopters and vehicles that had become the soundtrack of her new life. The offer was generous, higher salary, better benefits, recognition of her contributions, and assurance that she could work as long as she wanted. A year ago, such a letter would have been everything she wanted. Now, it felt like a hollow gesture from an institution that had only recognized her value after it became publicly embarrassing to have discarded her. "Thinking about going home?" Dr. Peterson asked, finding her with the letter in her hands. "Thinking about what home means," Sarah replied. 6 months ago, I thought home was that sterile hospital where I spent 35 years. Now I'm not so sure." The decision about extending her deployment became more complex as Sarah realized how much her work in Fallujah had changed not just her patients' lives, but her own understanding of what medicine could be. Here, she wasn't just a surgeon, she was a mentor, a symbol of hope, and a bridge between different worlds of medical practice. General Thompson visited again as Sarah's original deployment neared its end. This time, he brought news that would change everything. "Dr. Mitchell, I've been authorized to offer you something unprecedented. We're creating a new position, Senior Medical Advisor for Combat Surgery." It would involve splitting your time between field work and training programs, sharing your expertise with military medical personnel worldwide. The position would mean more than just extending her stay in Iraq. It would be a formal recognition of the value of experience in medicine, a role that could influence military medical practice for years to come. What would that mean for someone my age? Sarah asked. General Thompson smiled. It would mean that the Army officially recognizes that some things can't be taught in medical school or learned from textbooks. It would mean that your experience becomes part of our institutional knowledge instead of being discarded because of an arbitrary number. As Sarah considered the offer, she received visits from some of the patients whose lives she had saved during her time in Fallujah. Sergeant Rodriguez, now fully recovered, came to thank her before being transferred to a new assignment. "Dr. Mitchell, I heard you might be leaving soon. I wanted you to know that you didn't just save my life, you showed me what it means to never give up, even when everything seems impossible." The young Iraqi girl, now healthy and vibrant, brought Sarah a drawing she had made of the two of them together. In the child's artwork, Sarah was depicted as much larger than life, surrounded by healing light. It was a child's perspective, but it captured something profound about the impact one person could have when their skills were truly valued and utilized. The local Iraqi medical staff also organized a farewell gathering, though they were hoping she would stay. Dr. Ahmed Hassan, a young Iraqi surgeon who had worked alongside Sarah, spoke for the group. "Dr. Mitchell, you have taught us that medicine has no age, no nationality, no politics. You have shown us that experience is a treasure that should be honored, not discarded. If you stay, we continue learning. If you go, we will miss not just your skills, but your wisdom." As Sarah's decision deadline approached, she realized that her choice was about more than just her own career. The story of the surgeon of Fallujah had sparked conversations about age discrimination in medicine, about the value of experience, and about how society treats its most skilled practitioners. Medical schools began inviting her to speak about her experiences. Professional organizations started reconsidering their attitudes toward older physicians. The narrative that experience was a liability had been challenged by her work under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Dr. Chen, her former mentor, called from Baltimore with an offer that surprised Sarah. The medical college wants to create an endowed chair position focused on the value of experience in medicine. They're calling it the Mitchell Chair for Senior Medical Practice. They want you to come back and teach, to research best practices for utilizing experienced physicians, to challenge the age discrimination that's become so common. It was another option Sarah hadn't considered, returning to civilian medicine not as a discarded practitioner, but as a recognized expert whose experience had proven itself under fire. The night before she had to make her decision, Sarah walked through the medical facility one last time. The converted school building had become more than just a workplace. It had become the place where she rediscovered her purpose and value as a physician. In the main operating room, she could almost hear the echoes of all the lives that had been saved there, all the families who had been reunited because someone with steady hands and decades of experience had been available when hope seemed lost. Dr. Peterson found her there, still contemplating her choice. "Whatever you decide, Dr. Mitchell, I want you to know that working with you has changed how I think about medicine. You've shown me that experience isn't just about knowing procedures, it's about having the wisdom to make the right decisions under pressure." The next morning, Sarah called General Thompson with her decision. She would accept the senior medical advisor position, but with modifications. She would split her time between field assignments, training programs, and working with civilian medical institutions to address age discrimination. "I want to make sure that what happened to me at Chicago General doesn't happen to other experienced physicians," she told the general. "We need to bridge the gap between military medicine that values experience and civilian medicine that often discards it." The announcement of her new role made headlines worldwide. "Discarded surgeon becomes military's top medical advisor," read one newspaper. "From forced retirement to combat hero," proclaimed another. But, for Sarah, the headlines missed the real story. This wasn't about personal vindication or career advancement. It was about proving that society's treatment of aging professionals was not just unfair but counterproductive. Her first speaking engagement in the new role was at Chicago General Hospital, where the administration had requested she address their medical staff about her experiences. Standing in the same auditorium where she had once sat through budget meetings that determined her fate, Sarah looked out at faces both familiar and new. 6 months ago, this institution determined that my experience was a liability, she began. Since then, I've performed surgery in conditions that would challenge the most advanced trauma centers, I've saved lives that others might have given up on, and I've proven that experience has value that can't be measured by birthdays or retirement calculations. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. But this isn't just about me, Sarah continued. It's about every experienced professional who's been discarded because someone confused age with obsolescence. It's about recognizing that in medicine, as in many other fields, experience isn't just useful, it's irreplaceable. After her speech, Dr. Harrison, the chief of staff who had delivered her retirement notice, approached her privately. "Dr. Mitchell, I want to apologize. We made a mistake, and we're trying to learn from it. Would you consider consulting with us on developing better policies for experienced physicians?" Sarah looked at him thoughtfully. "Dr. Harrison, I'm not interested in returning to work here. But I am interested in making sure this doesn't happen to other qualified physicians. Let's talk about how to create a system that values experience instead of fearing it." As Sarah left Chicago General that day, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from forced retirement to international recognition. The same hands that had been deemed too old for their operating rooms had performed miracles in Iraq. The same mind they had considered past its prime was now shaping military medical policy worldwide. The young Iraqi girl's drawing was framed in her new office at the Pentagon, a reminder that sometimes the most important work comes when you least expect it, when society counts you out but circumstances demand that you prove them wrong. Sarah's story became more than just personal triumph, it became a catalyst for change in how medical institutions viewed their most experienced practitioners. The surgeon of Fallujah had proven that in medicine, as in life, wisdom and skill don't diminish with age, they deepen, becoming more valuable precisely when they seem most obsolete. And, in operating rooms from military bases to civilian hospitals, young doctors began to understand that the steady hands and clear judgment of their senior colleagues weren't relics of the past, but treasures to be preserved and respected for the lives they could still save.